Rick Ness had to move fast, or lose everything. That is not a clickbait exaggeration. That is the reality of what played out on his claim during the most critical 48-hour window of the entire season. And if you have been following Rick's journey over the past few years, you already know that he has been fighting an uphill battle that would have broken most people. But this was different. This was not about machinery breaking down or ground freezing too early. This was about a single decision that had to be made in a matter of hours. A decision that would determine whether Rick Ness walked away with millions or watched his entire season collapse into dust. To understand why the pressure was so intense, you have to look at what Rick was up against before this moment even arrived. Coming into this season, Rick was already operating from behind. He lost key members of his crew. He dealt with equipment failures that ate through his budget before he even moved his first yard of dirt. And on top of all of that, he was mining ground that had a reputation for being unpredictable at best and completely unforgiving at worst. The Valhalla claim, as impressive as it sounds, does not give up its gold easily. It requires precision, patience, and a crew that can execute under pressure. Rick had 2 out of 3, but patience was wearing thin. Then came the warning signs. It started with the water levels. Anyone who has spent time around placer mining knows that water is both your best friend and your worst enemy. Too little, and you cannot process material. Too much, and your equipment becomes a liability rather than an asset. On Rick's claim, the water situation had been stable for weeks. Not perfect, but manageable. Then something changed. The pumps started working harder. The intake lines began pulling more sediment than usual. And the tailings pond, which should have been holding steady, began rising faster than the crew could account for. Rick noticed it first. He has been around mining long enough to recognize when something is off, even before the numbers confirm it. He walked the site at dawn, something he does every day, and stood at the edge of the cut, looking at the water pooling in places where it should not have been. The ground was weeping, not flooding, not yet, but weeping. That slow, steady seeping of water through the gravel layers that tells you something underneath has changed. The permafrost barrier that had been holding back the underground flow was either melting or cracking. Either way, the clock was now ticking. He called his foreman over, and they stood there in silence for a full minute just watching. Then Rick said what everyone was thinking. If that water rises another foot, we lose the lower cut. And losing the lower cut meant losing access to the richest ground they had identified all season. The lower cut was where the gold was. The upper layers had paid the bills, kept the crew paid, kept the fuel tanks full. But the lower cut was the difference between a profitable season and a season that barely broke even. Rick had done the math. He knew exactly what was at stake. The crew gathered for the morning meeting, and Rick laid it out with no filter. He told them they had approximately 48 hours to strip the remaining overburden from the lower cut, establish a new sump, and reconfigure the water management system to handle whatever was coming up from below. If they succeeded, they could keep mining through the scheduled window. If they failed, they would have to abandon the lower cut entirely and move to a backup plan that offered maybe half the potential return. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. They just nodded and went to work. That is the kind of crew Rick has built. Not the biggest, not the flashiest, but tough. The kind of people who do not waste energy on panic because they are too busy solving problems. Over the next several hours, the excavators ran non-stop. The rock trucks moved material faster than anyone thought possible, and Rick himself stayed in the command seat of the main excavator, digging with a precision that comes from thousands of hours of experience. He was not just moving dirt. He was reading the ground, adjusting his cuts based on the way the material broke, watching for the color changes in the gravel that signaled the presence of gold-bearing layers. By the end of the first day, they had made progress. Not enough to feel safe, but enough to believe it was possible. The lower cut was exposed down to the bedrock in a series of stepped benches. The water was still rising, but slowly now, because the new sump was pulling it away faster than before. Rick walked the site again at dusk and allowed himself a few minutes of cautious optimism. Then he saw something that wiped the optimism away. Near the eastern edge of the cut, where the bedrock dipped down into a trough they had not fully mapped, there was a new spring. Not seepage, a spring. Water pushing up from below with enough force to carry fine sand with it. That meant the source of the water was not just melting permafrost. It was pressurized groundwater from a deeper aquifer. And if that aquifer had found a path to the surface, no sump in the world was going to keep up for long. Rick stood there watching the sand boil up from the bottom of the trough, and made the call that would define his season. He radioed his foreman and told him to bring every available pump to the eastern edge. Then he climbed back into the excavator and started digging a trench to channel the spring toward the sump, instead of letting it spread across the cut. It was past midnight when he finally climbed out. His hands were shaking from the vibration of the machine. His eyes were burning from dust and diesel exhaust. But the spring was contained. For now, the next morning brought new problems. The pumps were holding, barely, but the fuel consumption was astronomical. Rick calculated that they had enough diesel to run at this rate for another 36 hours. After that, they would have to shut down or bring in a fuel truck, which would cost time they did not have. The crew worked through breakfast, through lunch, through the afternoon heat. Nobody complained, nobody slowed down. They knew what was riding on this dot, and then, just as the sun was starting to go down on the second day, Rick saw what he had been hoping for. The bedrock in the lower cut was finally dry enough to work. Not bone dry, but dry enough. He climbed into the cut with a sample bucket and a shovel and started digging test holes by hand. Something he almost never does anymore because he has equipment to do it for him. But this was different. He needed to know immediately. Not in an hour when the test results came back from the lab. He scooped gravel from the bedrock interface, the layer where gold settles because it is too heavy to stay suspended in moving water, and carried it to the nearest sluice. The crew gathered around as he ran the material through. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the water flowing over the riffles and the rattle of gravel against steel. Then Rick reached into the sluice and pulled out the first nugget. It was not huge, maybe a quarter ounce, but it was unmistakable. Solid, water-worn, beautiful. He held it up so everyone could see and said 2 words. "We stay." The crew erupted, not because of one nugget, but because of what it meant. If there was gold in that test hole, there was gold across the entire lower cut. The water had not won. The spring had not won. The clock had not won. Rick Ness had made the right call, moved fast, and saved his season. But that is not the end of the story. Because what happened next, after the celebration faded and the pumps kept running, changed how Rick thinks about mining forever. The victory in the lower cut bought Rick Ness something more valuable than gold. It bought him time. But time on a mining claim is never free. Every hour that passed brought new challenges, and the same water that had nearly ended his season was still there, still rising, still pressing against the makeshift barriers he had thrown up in those desperate 48 hours. The difference now was that Rick was no longer reacting. He was planning. What happened next is a masterclass in crisis mining. The kind of on-the-fly engineering that separates the operators from the owners. Rick did not just want to survive the season. He wanted to thrive. And that meant turning the water problem into an asset rather than a liability. So he did something that surprised everyone on his crew, including his foreman. He decided to stop fighting the water and start using it. Here is what most people do not understand about placer mining. Water is not just necessary for processing material. It is also a tool for moving material. If you have enough water pressure and enough fall, you can hydraulic mine using the force of water to break down gravel banks and wash them toward your recovery system. Rick had been avoiding this approach because it required a level of water management that his claim had never supported. But now, with the aquifer pushing water to the surface whether he wanted it or not, he had more water than he knew what to do with. So he decided to put that water to work. The plan was risky. He would dig a series of channels from the springs to the upper edge of the lower cut, then use the natural slope of the ground to direct the flow across the richest gravels. The water would break down the material, wash it toward a collection point, and then be pumped into the wash plant. In theory, it would save hours of excavator time and thousands of gallons of diesel. In practice, it could also flood the entire cut if he miscalculated even slightly. Rick spent an entire day walking the ground with a laser level and a notebook, calculating slopes and flow rates. He marked the channels with spray paint, adjusted the angles twice, then adjusted them again. His crew watched from a distance, not interrupting, because they had learned that Rick does his best thinking alone. When he finally called him over, he had a plan that was simple enough to execute in a day, but precise enough that a single mistake could ruin everything. The excavator started cutting the channels at dawn the next morning. Rick ran the lead machine himself, carving a main channel that dropped exactly 6 inches over 100 feet. That was the magic number. Steeper than that, and the water would move too fast, eroding the banks and dumping sediment where he did not want it. Shallower than that, and the water would not have enough force to break down the gravel. 6 inches per 100 feet was the sweet spot, and Rick hit it within a fraction of an inch on every section. While he was cutting the main channel, the rest of the crew was installing a series of check dams, small barriers that would slow the water just enough to let the heaviest materials settle out before the flow reached the wash plant. These check dams were made from sandbags and steel sheet, nothing fancy, but they had to be placed with millimeter precision. Too high, and the water would back up and flood the cut. Too low, and the dams would do nothing at all. By midday, the system was ready. Rick stood at the top of the main channel with a shovel in his hand and a radio in the other. He gave the order to open the first spring, then walked alongside the channel as the water began to flow. It moved exactly the way he had calculated, fast enough to carry material, but slow enough to stay contained. The check dams caught the heaviest sediment. The main channel held its shape, and at the bottom of the cut, where the water spilled into the collection point, the wash plant was already running, processing the first material of the new system. The crew gathered around the sluice boxers as the first run of material came through. Nobody expected much. This was just overburdened, the top layer of gravel that rarely carries significant gold. But when Rick pulled the mats, what he saw made him stop. There was gold in the overburden. Just fine dust, but pickers, small nuggets. That should not have been there because overburden is supposed to be stripped and discarded, not processed. The fact that gold was showing up in the first run meant one of two things. Either the ground was richer than anyone had estimated, or the new water system was recovering material that the old system had been missing. Either way, it was good news. Rick ran the numbers in his head while the crew reset the sluice boxers. If the overburden was carrying gold, the pay gravel underneath would be exponentially richer. He had already calculated a potential payout of several $1,000,000 from the lower cut based on the original test holes, but those test holes had been drilled before the water system was redesigned. Now, with better recovery, the numbers might be significantly higher. He did not say any of this out loud. Rick is careful about making promises he cannot keep. But his crew knew him well enough to see the shift in his energy. He was moving faster, talking less, thinking ahead. That is what Rick Ness looks like when he smells gold. The next several days were a blur of activity. The water system worked better than anyone had hoped, processing material at nearly twice the rate of the old setup. The pumps ran continuously, pulling water from the collection point and sending it through the wash plant in a closed loop that minimized waste and maximized efficiency. Rick barely slept. He ate meals, standing up. With one eye on the gauges and one ear on the radio, his crew matched his pace, working 12-hour shifts without complaint because they could see the gold building up in the sluice boxers. Then, on the 5th day of the new system, Rick got the call he had been waiting for. The way out. The gold had been cleaned, dried, and poured into the scale. The number that came back was bigger than anyone had predicted. Not by a little, by a lot. Rick Ness had just pulled more gold in 5 days than most mines produce in a month. And he had done it by doing the one thing that most miners are too stubborn to try. He stopped fighting the water and let it work for him. But the story does not end with the big way out. Because success in mining attracts attention, and the attention Rick was about to receive came from someone he never expected to hear from again. The gold weighed out at just over 800 ounces. That is roughly $1.6 million at current prices, pulled from the lower cut in 5 days of running the new water system. Rick Ness looked at the number on the scale and did something his crew had never seen him do before. He sat down. Not because he was tired, although he was, but because the weight of what they had just accomplished finally hit him. This was not a lucky strike. This was not a patch of ground that happened to be rich. This was engineering. This was problem solving. This was a man who had been told he could not do it, proving everyone wrong. But the phone call came 3 days later. Rick was in the shop, welding a crack in one of the pump housings, when his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, because welding requires focus, and distractions cost time. Then, it buzzed again, and again. He pulled off his helmet and looked at the screen. The name made his stomach drop. It was someone from the corporate office of the company that had sold him the claim. Not the local representative he dealt with on a daily basis, someone higher. Someone who only calls when something has gone wrong, or when something has gone very right. Rick stepped outside and took the call. The conversation was brief and businesslike. The corporate representative had seen the production numbers from the lower cut and wanted to know how Rick had increased his recovery so dramatically. Rick explained the water system, the channels, the check dams, the redesigned flow. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the representative asked a question that Rick was not expecting. He asked if Rick would be willing to share his design with other miners operating on adjacent claims. This is where the story takes a turn that most people will not understand unless they have spent time in the mining world. Mining is competitive. Claims are staked, ground is fought over, and information is guarded like gold itself. Most miners would have said no. Most miners would have hung up the phone and kept their secrets to themselves, because giving away an advantage is the same as giving away money. But Rick Ness is not most miners. He thought about it for a moment, then said, yes. He would share the design. He would even walk the other miners through the system, explain the calculations, show them where the check dams needed to be placed. But he had one condition. Anyone who used his system had to help him with something in return. He needed better mapping of the underground water sources across the entire claim block. If the other miners were going to benefit from his engineering, they had to contribute their own data to a shared understanding of what was happening beneath the surface. The representative agreed. Within a week, Rick was standing on an adjacent claim, pointing at channels and explaining slope ratios to a group of miners who had been skeptical of him for years. They listened, they asked questions, they took notes, and then they went back to their own ground and started cutting their own channels. Using Rick's design as a template, what happened next is the part of this story that never makes it into the headlines. The adjacent miners did not just copy Rick's system. They improved it. One of them figured out a way to line the channels with inexpensive plastic sheeting that reduced erosion and extended the life of the system. Another developed a simple valve setup that allowed individual springs to be opened and closed independently, giving miners precise control over water flow without having to climb down into the cut. And another, a former engineer who had retired to mining as a second career, designed a monitoring system that used floating sensors to track water levels in real time and send alerts to a phone. Rick took all of these improvements and incorporated them into his own operation. Within a month, his water system was not just better than it had been. It was better than anything on the entire claim block. The shared knowledge had raised everyone's game, including his own. And the gold numbers reflected it. By the end of the season, Rick Ness had pulled more than $4 million out of the lower cut alone. The adjacent claims had pulled another $2 million combined. Everyone won. But here is the question that nobody asked Rick during all of this. Why did he say yes? Why did he give away an advantage that could have kept him ahead of his competitors? For years, the answer tells you more about Rick Ness than any gold way out ever could. He said yes because he remembered what it felt like to be the guy who had nothing. He remembered the seasons when his equipment broke down and he could not afford to fix it. He remembered the years when he was borrowing fuel money just to keep the pumps running. And he decided that he did not want to be the kind of miner who hoarded knowledge while others struggled. That is not a sentimental story. It is a strategic one. Rick understood something that a lot of miners never figure out. The ground does not care who is mining it. The gold does not care who finds it. The only thing that matters is whether you are still in the game at the end of the season. And the best way to stay in the game is to build relationships with the people around you. Because the day will come when you need their help as much as they needed yours. That day came sooner than Rick expected. Late in the season, one of the pumps on his main wash plant failed catastrophically. The bearing housing cracked, sending metal shards through the impeller and destroying the entire assembly. The pump was irreparable. The nearest replacement was 3 days away. Rick stood there looking at the wreckage and calculated the cost. 3 days of downtime meant roughly $200,000 in lost production. That was not just bad. That was season ending. He picked up his phone and called the adjacent miner who had designed the plastic channel liners. That miner had a spare pump, the exact same model, sitting in his equipment yard. He had been holding on to it as a backup. When Rick asked if he could borrow it, the miner did not hesitate. He said yes. No contract. No deposit. Just a handshake and a promise to return it when the new pump arrived. The spare pump was delivered within 2 hours. Rick's crew installed it in 90 minutes. The wash plant was running again before the end of the shift. $200,000 in lost production had been avoided because Rick had chosen to share his knowledge instead of hoarding it. That is the real lesson of the lower cut. Not the water system. Not the gold. Not the engineering. The lesson is that mining is not a solo sport. It is a community. And the miners who figure that out are the ones who last. Rick Ness finished the season with more gold than he had ever pulled in a single year. The lower cut produced beyond anyone's expectations. The water system became the standard for the entire claim block. And the miners who had once viewed Rick as a competitor now viewed him as a partner. That is what moving fast bought him. Not just survival. Not just a profitable season. But a place in a network of miners who will have his back for years to come. If there is one thing to take away from this story, it is this. The next time you are facing a crisis, do not just ask how you can save yourself. Ask how you can help the people around you. Because the help you give today is the help you will receive tomorrow. Rick Ness learned that lesson in the lower cut. With water rising around his boots and $1 million hanging in the balance, and it changed everything about how he mines.